Thank you. Our next item of business this afternoon is topical questions, and we start with question number 1 from Annie Wills.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government what its response is to reports that the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital faces a repair bill of up to £50 million.
Cabinet Secretary Jean Freeman.
Reports that the hospital requires repairs of around £50 million are inaccurate, and the Board does not recognise this figure, as it has made clear in public statements. The Board is investing £2.75 million in a water treatment plant and upgrades to the hematology ward at the Royal Hospital for Children. There are no other significant investments required in the 2 new hospitals. However, the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital is part of the wider Queen Elizabeth campus, which includes older buildings. And as with all estates, maintenance is an ongoing process, and the Board continues to work through the required maintenance in the older parts of the campus.
Annie Wills.
I thank the Minister for her answer, and I appreciate that this, of course, is not an official figure. Although this is understood to have been given by the Health Board's Estates and Facilities Manager to the Corporate Management Team in January. NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde also admitted that problems, as the Cabinet Secretary stated, with older buildings on the campus would require significant investment. There is undoubtedly a growing list of problems at the Queen Elizabeth, and we're hearing of new issues every week. And only last week we saw the publication of the Health Care Improvement Scotland report, which highlighted over 300 outstanding maintenance jobs, as well as there being no current clear ventilation structure. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary to provide details on how much the Scottish Government expects it will cost to fix the infrastructure issue at the hospital? And can she reassure patients in Glasgow that this will not have a knock-on effect to other services?
Cabinet Secretary.
So let me repeat that the £50 million is not a figure recognised by the Board, because it's not an accurate figure. It is not a figure that applies to either the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital or the Royal Hospital for Children. So it does not apply to the 2 new hospitals. What the campus has is a number of older buildings, including neurology and neurosciences, physical disabled rehabilitation, clinical genetics, pathology, and the Board is working through what the maintenance requirements of those buildings are, as you would expect it to do, and where the priority should lie according to which of those buildings provides patient care, which again is what you would expect it to do. In terms of the 300 outstanding jobs, as we look at what those are, many of those range from what would be basic small-scale maintenance that should be part and parcel of a normal programme of ongoing maintenance, everything from fixing taps to light bulbs, through to jobs that are about ensuring infection prevention and control. The Board has produced a detailed plan in response to the Inspectorate's unannounced inspection, which I commissioned. I have made clear my view of that inspection report. It is important to put on the record here in this Parliament that the inspection report was very clear that frontline staff were doing all that they possibly could to prevent infection and control it where it arose, that they understood their role and that they were following all the right patient safety protocols. But what was wrong was the issues where they raised them were not being properly heard and addressed. I had the Board's annual review yesterday. We went through the detail of their plan. We will continue to monitor very closely what they are doing, and when they produce what they believe to be their maintenance requirement for those older buildings, then that will be part and parcel of the conversation we will have with this Board as we have with other boards. The key in terms of whether it not affects other areas is whether or not the maintenance that is required for patient safety and patient care, in which case it obviously is priority maintenance.
Annie Wills.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for her answer, and yes, I have seen her comments on the report as well, and I appreciate that. But the same HIS report also highlighted staff shortages, both cleaners, for which we know there is a 10% vacancy rate for domestic staff, as well as infection control doctors, who play a crucial role in assessing infection risks presented by the built environment. Will the Health Secretary outline what urgent action the Scottish Government are taking in order to recruit cleaning staff so that this flagship hospital is fully resourced?
Cabinet Secretary.
So as part of the annual review, as I'm sure Ms Wells knows, one of the groups of people that I meet indeed my ministerial colleagues meet in annual reviews, is the Area Partnership Forum, which has represented on it all the staff side trade unions, the RCN and others, and the Area Clinical Forum, which brings together senior clinicians from across all the board's areas of work. And in both of those forums and those meetings yesterday, we discussed that inspection report. It is clear that Greater Glasgow and Clyde in this area carries a higher than acceptable level of unfilled domestic posts. There is a much higher than acceptable level of sickness absence amongst domestic staff. It wouldn't be too hard to work out why that might be the case. And also in maintenance staff. And Greater Glasgow and Clyde, who are the employers and therefore have to take the action to fill these posts, have had a very clear message from me that I expect them to take that action and fill those posts, and we will be monitoring that very closely, as we will monitor too their review of a decision that predates all of this by some years to go to a generic maintenance role as opposed to specific areas of maintenance like a plumber or a joiner and so on, and they are considering whether that really does, that generic role really does work for them, and whether or not that hampers their recruitment in ways that you would not otherwise expect it to. So they are engaged in all of that activity. I have discussed it with them, with those other two areas as I've described, and we will be monitoring this very closely, and also through the DG for Health, looking at all our other boards to assure ourselves that similar issues are not also in those other areas.
I've got three more supplementaries. I'd really like succinct questions and answers, please. Monica Lennon to be followed by Emma Harper.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. If not 50 million, can the Cabinet Secretary say what figure the Health Board does recognise in terms of the repair bill? And in response to the damning report into the Queen Elizabeth, Dr Lewis Morrison, the chair of the BMA in Scotland, said that without the right staff in place, it is hard to see how real improvements can be made. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree with Dr Morrison? And with staffing levels, building maintenance, cleanliness and infection control causing concern at Scotland's flagship hospital, she will know that people right across Scotland are worried about the rest of our hospitals. Should they be worried, Cabinet Secretary?
Cabinet Secretary.
As I think I've already explained, can't give the exact figure to Ms Lennon because the Health Board are working through what requires to be done in those older buildings, exactly how much that would cost and where the priority areas should lie. Very happy to make that available, as the Board will make it public once they've reached that final figure. In terms of what Dr Morrison said, of course I agree with Dr Morrison. It is self-evident that you need to have the right staff in place. We've had these discussions with the BMA. You have to have the right staff in place with the right skill mix in order to do the job that we require them to do. And the Board, in these particular areas of maintenance and domestic staff, as I've already said to Ms Wells, are working on that, and we will be monitoring that closely. In terms of other health boards, as I've said, Malcolm Wright, our interim Director General for Health, himself a former Chief Executive, and our Chief Executive for NHS Scotland, is working directly, along with our Chief Nursing Officer, with the Chief Execs of all our other health boards, to ensure that in the specific areas that inspection report, which I commissioned, have highlighted, that we have the answers from all the other boards in terms of where they sit against those recommendations and against our expectations of them, including their statutory responsibilities.
Emma Harper to be followed by Daniel Johnson.
Thank you, President Officer. Would the Cabinet Secretary be able to outline what progress has been made in recent years on reducing hospital-acquired infections?
Cabinet Secretary.
So since 2007 across Scotland, there has been an 88% fall in cases of C. difficile in patients aged 65 and over, and a 93% fall in levels of MRSA. Given that we are talking about Greater Glasgow and Clyde, the January figures published on the 8th of January show that the C. diff infection rates have been reduced there by 85% and MRSA rates reduced by 94%, in line with national figures. So as we've made clear, notwithstanding the serious difficulties that have been recounted in this chamber in terms of infections in Greater Glasgow and Clyde and the very great seriousness with which I take that. The Queen Elizabeth Hospital remains on par in terms of infection rates with the rest of Scotland, running at about 4% overall, whereas the Scottish average is 4.2%. And it is important to have that as part of the context of these discussions.
And Daniel Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The much-needed new Edinburgh Children's Hospital now has a new completion date of July, but that comes 7 years after the original scheduled date and a £16 million bill over and above the £150 million budget in order to complete it. Does this, coupled with the issues at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, point to wider problems regarding hospital building and procurement in the NHS in Scotland?
Briefly, it's a bit wide of the mark. Briefly, Cabinet Secretary.
It is indeed a wee bit wide of the mark, Presiding Officer. I'll do my best to answer it. In terms of your principal question, no, I don't think it does point to wider problems. As you will know, and as we would expect NHS Lothian to do, they made sure that some of the lessons coming out of the issues at Queen Elizabeth were being addressed in terms of that new sick kids hospital in Lothian in advance of accepting the handover of that new build to them. I would absolutely expect them to do that. Those matters take time for them to work through, and that, at least in part, describes some of the additional length to the process. It's excellent news that they will take it over from July and patients will be in there from July. I'm very happy to provide the member with additional information if he would care to ask me specific additional questions.
Thank you very much. And that concludes topical questions. We're going to move on now to the next item of business, which is a statement by Fergus Ewing on managing Scotland's fisheries in the future. And the Cabinet Secretary will take questions afterwards. So if members would like to ask a question, I would urge them to press their request to speak buttons as